In the universe of Warhammer 40k, there's a lot of tropes and influences all jammed together to make the magical setting we all know, love, and love to complain about. There's plenty of Gothic influence, if the name of the Imperial language being either High or Low Gothic didn't clue you in. Dune. Can't forget Dune. There's a whole lot of Dune in there, from navigators to god emperors. But sometimes the inspirations for something are a whole lot more varied, as in it isn't just X thing inspired Y thing, it's the creators of Y thing snorted an entire bag of nose candy, speed ran through a game of Cyberpunk 2020 while Dune, Mad Max, and 1984 were all running in the background, and handed the resulting mess to an editor. And that, my friends, is how we got Necromunda. This planet can charitably be described as a mess, but not in the usual way a planet is a mess in 40k like Armageddon or Vigilus. Sure, there are gene stealers here, but this isn't every Xenos faction coming to raid the Imperium. Sure, there's chaos cults aplenty, but even they aren't the focus. Nope, they're just small players in the games of the great houses of Necromunda. Because Necromunda is that most magical of places in 40k. A place that has the balls to stand up and say that even though there's a Space Marine chapter house on this planet, we do not care for the crap the fancy armor boys get up to. Strap in, find yourself a pistol that looks like it might almost work, and get ready to raid that fancy-looking Van Saar cache. Because today, we're taking a look at Necromunda, where gang warfare, sci-fi action, and classy political intrigue all try to headbutt each other to death like there's no tomorrow. But if you lived on a hive city like Necromunda, you'd probably want something to drown out all the horrific noise going on. And for just such a purpose, you could do no better than Raycon and their everyday earbuds, the sponsor of this video. How about I hit you with some of the wonderful features these bad boys have? Money talks, but so does quality, and thankfully Raycon comes in swinging on both fronts. Not only are they higher quality than their competitors, they're half the costs. That is a good deal if I've heard one. But if for some reason you aren't satisfied, there's a 30-day return window. If you somehow aren't happy, it's easy to get your money back. Those things not enough to convince you? What if I told you they've got a 32-hour battery life? That's over a full day of listening to whatever you want with the best earbuds around. And their ergonomic design is the stuff of legend. You just fit it in your ears like so, and bing bang boom, you're ready for some quality sound wherever you're at. I've been using them a lot lately because I've caught what's probably just a small cold but what felt like the Black Death. They made lying under about 50 blankets a lot more bearable, and when I knocked them off my bed because I was barely conscious for a good 2 days, the protective case made sure they were safe and sound. Does all that sound good to you? Well, how about I make this deal even better? Go to buyraycon.com/PancreasNoWork to save big for the holidays and get up to 25% off site-wide. That's right, you'll get up to 25% off everything on Raycon's website when you go to buyraycon.com/PancreasNoWork. And if you order by December 15th, you'll get them just in time for Christmas. You deserve the best listening experience possible, and with Raycon's everyday earbuds, you can experience music, podcasts, and so much more like never before. Now then, time to overdose on grimdark psycho and go fistfight an Ogryn. Necromunda's backstory is similar to that of pre-Great Crusade civilizations like the Interrex. Happily for us, however, it doesn't have the same ultimate fate as those guys. Once upon a time, Necromunda was known as Irenaeus Prime, the industrious heart of a civilization known as the Irenaeus Continuity. It was ruled by techno-nobles and was even for the time a highly industrious world, and its rulers were ever hungry for more and more materials to supply their needs. Unlike the vast majority of human worlds during the Age of Strife, the Continuity had access to stable warp gates allowing for interstellar travel, an incredible rarity that would allow them to prosper where many others regressed. One fateful day, a squadron of ships returning from an Imperial conquest would find themselves brought instead into the realm of the Irenaeus Continuity. Before they could so much as take a moment to figure out where they had ended up, they were invaded by soldiers enhanced with advanced cybernetics, completely wiping them out. The death cries of their astropaths were heard in Imperial space, and in response the Imperium actually sent an envoy fleet to convince them to join up with them. It's quite nice to see that they actually tried diplomacy first, but you know how that goes. If the Imperium tries diplomacy first, the other side has to act aggressively, otherwise Games Workshop would display the Imperium as the brutal and unnecessary dictatorship that it truly is, and that just wouldn't do. Yes, I am feeling quite bitter today. I've had a few drinks while writing this part of the script, so y'all get some of my honest feelings. The Continuity instead say they should join their space empire, to which the Imperium responded by sending a massive portion of the Imperial Fist to bring them to heel, led by one Hashin Yanad. Since the Imperial Fists are one of those more reliable chapters, this was done in relatively short order. 2 months to be precise. As their empire collapsed around them until all that was left was Irenaeus Prime, the Continuity surrendered, and since they had to live to become Necromunda, the Imperium accepted their offer of surrender and allowed them into the fold. This surrender would come just in time, as something unknown began pouring out of the warp gates. What exactly it is not stated, beyond something completely horrific and not demonic. Whatever these Xenos were, the best description of them is that they were a darkness deeper than the void, of living lightning and flame-wreathed chrome. They also snuffed out the very stars of 6 different systems. Given those descriptions, I'm going to assume they were late-game cravers from Endless Space who had managed to build a couple of obliterators. They were, of course, ultimately defeated, as this was the Great Crusade, so of course they were, but at the cost of Irenaeus Prime being the only planet left somewhat standing. Part of this was good old-fashioned Space Marine butt-kicking, part of this was Mr. Yanad destroying the warp gates so the problem would just stop showing up, which was a pretty sound solution. Imperial Fist can be smart, there's more than just fortify, defend, fortify. The planet was renamed Necromunda as a result of this fustercluck, a planet that had come ever so close to death but managed to keep on kicking. Pretty much ever since then, Necromunda has continued on as it once was, only now under Imperial control. A hive planet producing an incredible amount of resources and miscellaneous items to fuel the war machine of its overlords. Interestingly enough, little information is available on what Necromunda was up to during the early days of the Imperium's history. Knowing 40k, this can mean anything from it being traitorous but too valuable to destroy, to everyone just forgetting it existed for a bit and no one recording data on it because they forgot there was data to record. In the best case scenario though, it does paint it as a hive planet that was pretty peaceful in the grand scheme of things. And I do mean pretty peaceful, because in the entire 10,000 year history of the planet prior to the Great Rift, only 2 outside threats ever bothered it. One was an orc invasion that for multiple years somehow went entirely unnoticed. 3 entire hives of the planet were desecrated by orcs before someone realized that, oh shit, maybe we should deal with this. In addition to whatever Necromunda threw at it, a large force of Space Marines was sent in to deal with the issue as well. The remains are still there and known as the Skull for all the holes the orcs left poked in the hives, and they're completely uninhabited. Whether it be fear of any leftover greenskins, demons, or just plain old being haunted, no one seems to want to go near them. And given that no one has forced the lower hivers back into the hives, there may be some credence to this. The other big thing was a gene stealer infestation, because Necromunda is a hive world, and if you wait long enough, gene stealers just pop up on those. This time it was because the AdMech was doing some unsanctioned research, as they also tend to do if you leave them be long enough, and it was so bad the Inquisition had to get involved. The planetary defense batteries themselves ravaged Hive Secundus where the gene stealers were located, and they became so depleted that in the end a massive network of walls, trenches, and other fortifications were set up around Hive Secundus. It was completely cut off, with watch parties constantly observing the hive in case the cult tries to break free. Inside the hive, the primitive inhabitants of whoever survived wage war with the gene stealers to this day, because hive worlds really suck. I did of course say Necromunda was pretty peaceful in the grand scheme of the Imperium's history. If you look below the historical records, you see that the planet is anything but, of course. Noble politics, gang warfare, and minor religious crusades plague the inhabitants every single day. And the actual difference between these things is also completely inconsequential, and usually just boils down to who's paying the guy trying to cave your head in with a rock. And in fact, if I were to hazard a bit of a guess, the ultimate thing that makes Necromunda special is the fact that it's just the most focused on Hive World in the Imperium. I would bet this sort of thing rages across Hive Worlds the Imperium over. We just get to see what the specifics are like down in Necromunda. That's not to say Necromunda doesn't have some spice all to itself. One of the hives, Hive Mortis, is entirely devoted to breaking down the dead for everything from corpse starch to drugs after a plague ravaged its population. But the general vibe of Necromunda can probably be found all across the galaxy. Until relatively recently, the entire planet was ruled over by Lord Gerontius Helmar of House Helmar, the noble house that rules in the name of the glorious Imperium of mankind. In the history of planetary governors in the Imperium, he stood proud in his status as not the worst one to ever live. In terms of outright incompetence, there have been infinitely worse. In terms of corruption, the off-world trading port of Gothrul's Needle holds a monopoly on space commerce by virtue of Lord Helmar wanting it to have monopoly on space commerce. As I said, not the worst, but he could definitely be better. But then we come to the opening of the Great Rift and the maybe 42nd millennium, depending on which of the 500 different potential calendars you'd like to go by in this setting. On Necromunda, they call it the Great Darkness, which is a good sign of what's coming for this poor planet. Aside from the gigantic snail trail that's opened up across the stars, the planetary core of Necromunda has also started cooling down, which means even ignoring the presumably imminent collapse of the planet's magnetic field and the ensuing cancerification of everyone who lives on it, the industries of Necromunda are finally starting to die down after 10,000 years. But the planet's named Necromunda for a reason. If it came back from life before, it can do it again. Plus, if Necromunda died, then where would we go in the 41st millennium for gang warfare antics? If you say a Space Marine chapter homeworld, I'm gonna send a member of House Goliath to cave your skull in with a rock. Making matters worse for those who live on Necromunda, but better for political intrigue, Lord Helmar has been placed in medical stasis following a failed assassination attempt. And naturally, in his absence, everyone has been looking to fill the power vacuum. His 13th daughter Hera and a rebellious lord named Lady Credo were the two most prominent named figures fighting for Gerontius' former seat, and fitting for the name of the first event for all this, named Cynderac Burning, they mostly fought in the Hive of Cynderac. In a very 40k move, Cynderac was completely uninvolved in events prior to this, because even tens of thousands of years and hundreds of light years away from Earth, some poor bastard has to be Belgium caught between Germany and France. As it turns out, Credo and some insane redemptionist prophet dude were working for a man named Azostia Maranthus, the leader of what remains of a noble house thought long extinct. He eventually succeeded in his goals, now ruling over Necromunda, although Lady Hera is still making moves from the shadows to regain Helmar rule over the planet. If that constant barrage of proper nouns has left you feeling a little bit confused, then good, I've done my job. This is Imperial politicking. If you're not confused, you're not paying attention. Now with all that history out of the way, who are the major players? And more to the point, what are the great houses of Necromunda, combined with a little bit of information on some other playable factions? This is not Do or Don't Necromunda. This is more of a look at who you potentially can play and follow along in the fun little narrative of the planet. We'll start with the great houses. Going off the order they're listed in the web store, we start with House Cawdor. Tell me, how do you feel about religious extremism? Do you think that mankind would be much better off if we threw off the shackles of faith and embraced pure, scientific rationalism? Well then please get the hell off of my lawn, Redditor. House Cawdor wants nothing to do with you. House Cawdor is by no means the richest or most powerful of houses, but when you're the house surfing on the back of unmatched religious fervor, you don't need those things very much. Only coming to true power in the 39th millennium, with redemptionist faith gaining more popularity, in the 40th millennium, their head, known as the Thane of Cawdor, took on the faithful trappings and rode this tide of faith all the way to the top. The faith was so successful in its rise that it gained members in some of the other noble houses and even spread off-world, which for one of the countless thousands of cargo cults the Imperium gives birth to is very impressive. Unfortunately, redemptionism is one of those few forms of the Imperial cult that goes too far for even the Imperium of Man. Killing the heretics is good. Killing everyone you see that isn't a redemptionist because they're not a redemptionist and therefore bad is less good. When this includes ecclesiarchy priests and imperial nobles who are technically divinely mandated in their position, this is even less good. The Red Redemption was even worse, because somehow when it spread off-world it came back in an even more extreme form than what it already was. So eventually the faith was banned, but with the secret document all the other houses signed called the Pax Redemptos, it was allowed to stay, with the caveat that no one take up arms in the name of the redemption any longer. Similar to the Sisters of Battle, we've gotten the most lovely of loopholes from this. House Cawdor's massive horde of unwashed pilgrims no longer take up arms in the name of the redemption. They take up arms in the name of House Cawdor. The fact that House Cawdor is still firmly a part of the redemptionist faith is surely nothing you need to worry about. House Cawdor, for its part, is still one of, if not the poorest great house, balanced out by the fact there's an endless supply of dirty fanatics to draw from. The mainstay of their gangs is scrap-wielding nutjobs trying to kill you for their faith. Plenty of redemptionists ignored the Pax Redemptos and kept fighting in the name of the faith. They're just officially marked as renegades. Officially. Leading them will be dirty fanatical priests wearing metal braziers on their head that are lit, because I cannot emphasize enough how insane these people are. Scavenging for supplies is something every hiver does, but in House Cawdor, the act is regarded as sacred. In the Imperium of Man, all is the Emperor's, which means even what someone else considers to be the lowliest of trash is a sacred artifact. They're also, as I said, very poor, so it's equal parts faith and practicality. They even speak in a specific dialect of Low Gothic called the Pilgrim's Cant. It's just Low Gothic, but so loaded with religious symbolism and subtext that someone ordering a large fry and a Diet Coke comes across to an outsider as them preaching about how everyone around them has their souls eternally damned. I like to imagine what their version of coded speech is just them shouting out Warhammer lore as we understand it to people who could not care any less. They also mask their faces when they're on the clock, so to speak. Individuality is a sin, after all, and after the Pax Redemptos, their legal status as a gang is even more iffy than that sort of thing already is, so it doubles as a convenient way to hide themselves. When the mask comes off, so does their shift of firebombing the other house's property. Oh, and you know all those World War II stories of Soviets training dogs to run under German tanks with bombs strapped to them? They have that, but they couldn't afford the dogs, so they use big rats. Next up is House Delaque. House Delaque takes the mystique and intrigue of Imperial nobility and goes whole hog with it. They don't just like using assassins and spies, they're an entire house of assassins and spies. Sure enough, nobody in their right mind would ever trust a Delaque, but on the flip side, everyone will at least work with them because they usually know more than you do. Better to have the assassin working for you than against you, and they're the best information gatherers in the entire planet. If you need to find the drop in the ocean that a single human being in a Hive world is, House Delaque is your best bet. Their origins are as shrouded in mystique as their demeanor is. In M36, a lot of Necromundans started getting some strange dreams that coincided with a rogue planet named Somnus passing nearby the system. They started sleepwalking, and many of these people just weren't ever seen again. They just walk off into the night. More and more people vanished like this until eventually Somnus moved on, and they returned bound to a singular will. Delaque. Slowly, Delaque would convince Avarice to hand over their most valued commodities to them. Trade deals, factories, contracts, all the things that make a great house great. As they took more and more of Avarice Industries, they started their future habits of obsessing over concealment, misdirection, and other cloak and dagger work. Eventually, Avarice finally realized they weren't partners but being subjugated, but when they tried to protest this to the other houses, they were completely stonewalled. This was either because Delaque had gone to House Helmar for some secret deal, because the other houses didn't care about this one that somehow signed away its existence, or some combination of both. The last stand of House Avarice was a blip fought by whatever mercenaries and bounty hunters it could afford, and then House Delaque was here to stay. One thing that's needed to know about House Delaque is that will they all seem bound to in their earliest of days. Many outsiders, given their habit of shaving their head, their pale skin, and their light-sensitive eyes, believe them to be a house of psychers, if not outright gene stealers. Neither of these things are true, but the former does have some small amount of merit. The people of House Delaque are connected to one another via what's known as the Psychoterica. It's a gestalt consciousness that binds them together, but crucially, it's not a hive mind. Every member of House Delaque is their own person, and this has led to conflict within the house, but this does let them sense when someone is connected to the Psychoterra as well as when someone is not, as well as allow them to convey feelings and ideas to one another. Another important thing to keep in mind is that the stereotypical image most people have in Necromunda of a member of House Delaque is not what the majority of them look like. Most of them, who are known within House Delaque as the Lost, are just going to look like and indeed be normal folk. When they sense the Psychoterica connecting one of the Lost to the greater house, they'll reach out and recruit them through whatever means they deem necessary. And another thing, which incidentally I find kind of funny, is that their front organizations they run on lower levels operate more or less the same as their higher up, being all about clandestine stuff and the like. From top to bottom, they're all about information gathering, and whether that's subtly listening in on a conversation between nobles or spying from alleyways at other gang deals, the broad strokes are going to be the same. Dirty laundry is dirty laundry no matter who's airing it out, and House Delaque is there to see it all. Their weird brain-mind thing has let them do some strange stuff, such as their work with the Piscian Spectre. They're an allied race of Xenos fish people that can be heavily augmented, as well as have access to the Psychoterica itself. And just to wrap us up, allow me to tell you where the Psychoterica probably comes from. If you couldn't tell what this whole house is a reference to yet, you probably will be able to soon. Millions of years before it was a hive planet, Necromunda was home to vast oceans teeming with life. Nowadays, they're oceans of sludge that the Necromundans grow mushrooms on to eat, but back then they were home to a race of beings known as Leviathans, worshipped by the other natives as gods. As time passed, the climate changed as they tend to do on this time scale, and the oceans were in danger of drying up. The surface dwellers built massive underground reservoirs for their gods to dwell in, presumably died out themselves, and when humanity came to inhabit the world, they were none the wiser as to what lay beneath them. In time, when the sleeping sickness caused by Somnus came, these creatures were able to influence the dreams of those afflicted, and thus was their will once again brought to the surface world. And if you still aren't getting what's being ripped off of here, consider that House Delaque also has a unique language called the Dark Tongue. No one else can understand it, there's a high possibility that House Delaque doesn't truly understand it, and one of the lines of it is, "The deathless sleeper waits beneath the dead world." So good luck everyone on Necromunda, and quite possibly the galaxy as well, because Cthulhu waits beneath the surface, and his premier followers are an entire noble organization of gangbangers. Now we come to House Escher. The TLDR is that House Escher is the obligatory girls-only house to be used as a cudgel by someone on either side of the fence when the cyclical Warhammer Twitter argument makes its rounds. In practice, they're a lot more fun than those people usually bother to give them credit for, although in general Necromunda has escaped the usual arguments as a result of being less popular and in the spotlight. Besides, Necromunda is fun and unconnected to Space Marines, and most of the people who argue about Warhammer on Twitter are the type of people who haven't even heard of fantasy, let alone a 40k subgame, so we're probably safe here. Long ago, there was no House Escher, just 3 sisters who were legendary warrior types and supposedly immortal. In truth, they just cloned themselves in secret. After about 3,000 years or so of this, and allowing the exploits of themselves to fade into myth and legend, the 3 women pledged themselves to the future planetary governor. They realized that if things ever came to all-out war, their cloning procedures wouldn't save themselves from the constant respawning that would likely happen. So they split their genetic material into 5 boys and 7 girls, destroyed the vat since that's as good a way as any to make sure you stick to that no respawning oath, and formed the bloodline of House Ulandari. It was a noble house of human purity, since by virtue of everyone who started it being manufactured in a lab, there was no icky radiation poisoning or mutations in it. House Ulandari would eventually itself split into House Athenos, who still revered their first 3 founding mothers, and House Ulanti. Athenos took control of the chem trade and made all their money that way, and Ulanti was intermarried with other noble houses, which gave them plenty of good connections, but diluted that oh-so-precious Ulandari bloodline. They would fight each other occasionally, which particularly hurt Athenos, but when a splinter faction within Ulanti broke away that managed to trace its bloodline back to the OG 3 ladies, it formed House Ashaki and absorbed Athenos with minimal, if any, issues. As a newfound house by this point, which for the record is some time before but not too long before M38, House Ashaki had its fair share of troubles and rival houses to fight in order to establish itself as a real player in the game. Their inherited expertise in the chemical fields allowed them to augment their gangers well beyond their rivals and make them stand out, but this came at a cost you could probably guess at. Turns out, injecting yourself with an unstable mixture of PCP, heroin, and crack isn't good for the human body. Addiction ran rampant, and their men suffered increasingly more mutations and general side effects at birth, since apparently their concoctions really didn't like the idea of a Y chromosome. Nevertheless, they stuck with the chem trade, because when you control 90% of the drug market, the occasional guy melting from everything you pumped into him ain't that bad. In a sort of mirror to their initial beginnings, a band of women took the reins in M38 and turned House Ashaki into the House Escher Necromunda knows and loves today. Any sort of chemical science you can think of, House Escher is all about it. Drugs, toxins, poisons, combinations of all 3. They've probably got the Family Guy tripling yourself drug lying around somewhere for that special occasion you need an Ogryn to vomit, shit, and orgasm all over your political rival. And please do have fun with that mental image. To get around the fact that nowadays all of their men are more or less born either brain dead or with every single condition you can imagine at the same time, they use their drug expertise to induce asexual pregnancy. Ironically enough, considering they hate each other, the new House Goliath exists because of House Escher. The super brutes that make it up nowadays were in part created due to Escher's work, and much of what Goliath uses to keep itself going comes from House Escher, despite the hatred they share for each other. They've got 3 major things keeping them going in modern Necromunda. They have great relations with the Water Guild that controls water on the planet, great relations with the Cold Trade that's all about smuggling Xenos tech, and pretty decent ties with House Ulanti, which is actually still around and kicking, giving them good access to the other noble houses of Necromunda. And controlling 90% of the chem trade. That's always going to be helpful for keeping power. Something else quite interesting to end on is that despite being the weird organic science faction, they're also the house that exports to the wider Imperium perhaps the most single common item you can ever find: the humble lasgun. Escher's lasguns are some of the most effective ones around. One of the other houses, Saar, does make better ones, but they're so complicated and hard to maintain that mass production of them isn't feasible. Escher's, meanwhile, hit that sweet spot where they're still great lasguns, but not impossible to maintain off-planet on campaign. Goes to show that if you can make something the Imperium wants, it'll let you get away with all sorts of bullshit back home. Up to and including using your weird chemicals to raise the dead as a discount Eversor assassin. On to the next house in the list, House Goliath. House Goliath is by far the newest great house in Necromunda. Originally, they were created to make a brand new breed of beings able to more effectively work the forges of the world, as well as to solve some genetic issues both House Escher and Saar were facing. Though the collaboration started and ended with creating this new breed of abhuman, the resulting Goliaths, as they were called, were nevertheless effective in the forges, though the genetic issues were still unsolved. Escher and Saar accused each other of betraying the other. House Helmar just shrugged and stuck them in the forges. It was initially believed that the Goliaths could be kept docile and controlled. After a few generations of them, though, naturally born or nat-born Goliaths started becoming a thing, and with it a marked increase in intelligence and lifespan, as well as a desire for freedom. Though they they certainly had their fair share of fights to become free, it wasn't as bloody as you'd think for a group of people that are closer to Fallout super mutants than humans to achieve. Much like with Escher, they were smart enough to realize that the Imperium doesn't really care if you exist as long as you don't disrupt things and do your job, and since they were so good in the forges, most people were willing to tolerate them. Their status as abhumans is a fuzzy thing, but overall when they are considered as such, they're still let be, since they're real good at forging stuff and also real scary to fight. To be sure, the other houses of Necromunda looked down on them for being a bunch of dumb, savage, classless brutes, and to be fair, they were literally genetically designed to be nothing more than organ donor sacks and to work the forges. But they're called House Goliath for a reason, so if you'd like to look one in the face and bring these things up, I can only say good luck, and ask that you post whatever happens on Necromundan Live Leak so we can all see how it goes for you. Despite the fact that they're less than 1,000 years old, they control Necromunda's forging with an iron grip, and they have official Imperial sanction to do so they're here to stay. House Goliath early on made deals with Von Saar for cloning facilities, as despite Natborn being a thing, the majority of them are still sterile. They eventually did manage to figure out how to do things more internally, though, all the better since no one wants to be reliant on another great house. They are still pretty reliant on Escher, but better to need one great house than to need two. House Goliath is proof of something that for some reason a whole lot of fans have a hard time internalizing. Making something of equal strength and toughness to a Space Marine really isn't that hard. The issue is that making something as strong, tough, and stable as a Space Marine is a fair bit harder. Goliaths come in 3 flavors: Vatborn, Natborn, and Unborn, and all of them are, as well as require, a mess of chemical cocktails that really don't sit well with the human body. The first 2 are pretty self-explanatory. Vatborn are the Goliaths that still come from Vats. Though House Goliath did break away from Vansar dependency for the most part, they don't really understand things fully. So sometimes a Goliath comes out stillborn, or just a mess of organic matter that is many things but barely a Goliath, let alone truly human. When they come out, and they're actually correctly made, they're fully grown and pretty much feral animals. To combat this, we have the mighty data slug process. Take some implants, fill them with their entire clan's history and culture, as well as other basic need-to-knows in life like speaking, and jam it in a newborn Goliath's brain. Oftentimes, this reduces the Goliath to a drooling wreck, because this is the equivalent of your entire formative years from birth to college jammed into you in about 5 minutes. If it works though, congrats, new Goliath. This new person is only kept together by something called a chem leash, which carefully balances the absurd amount of stimulants and chemicals needed to keep a Goliath alive. Too little and they destabilize and die. Too much and they enter a period of rampant growth and then die. All this to grant them the mighty lifespan of about 10 years. Poor guys don't even live as long as the Skaven do. This is also provided to them at least in part by House Escher, like I said, and the 2 houses do not get along. Economics are a must, however, and the trade between the 2 houses still flows, however tenuously. Natborn, meanwhile, are made from when a mommy and daddy Goliath love each other very much. If you're familiar with the Dark Eldar, they're treated pretty much exactly the same as Trueborn are. They get longer lives, less dependency on chems, although very crucially not no dependency, and they're more smarter. They can also live up to 50 years. Very impressive stuff. They of course take pride in coming out of a vagina instead of a tube, but they're also very cautious with their existence. Outside organizations keenly watch them, since Goliath's breeding was never an intended thing. It's kept as quiet and down low as it can be because, at least to my understanding, both options the Goliath faces are bad. While they are allowed to exist, if the Imperium decided they could become rampantly unchecked with their growth, they might just send in the Inquisition or Space Marines to do away with House Goliath. On the flip side, if the Imperium decides it could use mass-produced regiments of these guys, the other houses might unite to wipe them out, since that would easily spell their own fall to irrelevance as Goliath becomes the undisputed master house. Unborn are the odd men out, in that they didn't start as Goliaths. If someone wants to become one, they have to go through a process that makes them one. This process is not at all standardized between groups of Goliaths, not at all safe physically because it rewrites your DNA into something that needs dozens of different steroids and other drugs to be stable, and not safe mentally because the data slug is still putting entire sets of formative years into your head. But if it works, it brings new genetic diversity into a gene pool that could really use some of that. All of these groups are heavily reliant on the chem leash, but each group of Goliath has different needs, each strain of Goliaths has different needs, and quite frankly, Goliath leaders also have different needs. Overall, it sucks to be a Goliath. Our second to last great house is House Orlock. This is Darkwing's least favorite house, since it's a big old group of dirty, disgusting miners. House Orlock isn't the most interesting one to me, but they are undoubtedly a great house. On a hive that produces as much as Necromunda, if you control the metal in the mines, you can make a damn fine name for yourself. Their history actually begins in the ash wastes outside of the hive. one group of bandits, led by one Olandus Orlock, was particularly prosperous. In M38, he and some family had to take shelter in an ancient starship, but luckily for them, this turned out to be incredibly fortunate, as the ship contained a treasure trove of archaeotech. Allying or threatening other rival families into working with him, this brought his wealth up to the level that he could wage war with one of the noble houses, House Orland. It went so poorly for House Orland that when the head of it went to House Helmar for help, they just told him this was an internal matter and he better not affect the tides with his crap. When a young Orland daughter married Olandus' eldest son, House Orland's head was so heartbroken by the betrayal, he just walked off into the wastes, which is honestly pretty sad to read. I know he's imperial nobility, so you can assume he deserves anything bad that comes to him, but man, what a pathetic note to end out on. From this marriage, though, the House of Iron was born, and we can call them House Orlock going forward now to avoid the confusion of these almost identical names. House Orlock itself would end up becoming complacent over the years and rather decadent, and by M39 they had a pretty massive workers' rebellion on their hands. They tried to hire a bunch of mercenaries to deal with the rebellion, but the rebels controlled the mines, so when the mercenaries showed up, they just outbid the house leaders and bought the mercenaries over. The matter came to a close when a member of House Orlock had a pretty smart idea. Since he founded a wasteland town himself, he would use that influence to gain over the rebels to his side. With what would become known as the Code of Iron, he declared that it was gang before the house, house before the rest, and appealed greatly to the rebels, who wanted to go back to the days of old with hard-working miners and gang leaders running the show, not crummy nobles. He would go so far as to gain the trust of the rebel leader, making her his confidant, taking control of the rebellion and House Orlock itself as the new head. From this, we get House Orlock as it stands today. They have a long-standing feud with House Delaque, since their gangers overran a shipment that Delaque was overseeing and managed to steal a contract from House Ulanti from under them. Delaque tried to besiege their mining settlements in turn, but they discovered that there were too many of the damn things to ever hope to successfully do that. Now the houses hate each other. Orlock, meanwhile, has good relations with House Escher, and with everyone else, it's lukewarm. It's eh. The nobles control the common folk and their gangs through some impressive displays of Machiavellian scheming as well as just a small smidgen of actual generosity. Essentially, they have their gangs double as a middle class. Anyone can come to rise up from the lowest of ranks and join a gang, but their worth has to be approved by the gang itself. The end result is that they have a massive population, as all hives do, genuinely throwing themselves into their work and giving 110%, because they might get that sweet promotion to the gangs and out of a life of factory work. All under House Orlock are also allowed to use shortened versions of the noble family names, since they are a part of House Orlock, no matter their standing, and the general feeling that they matter and they've had to work hard for what they have keeps them all loyal. For the nobles' part, they promote the occasional rising star and let them have a bit more freedom than the lower castes of other houses, and they've got themselves an army and source of labor that's in some ways even more fanatical than that of House Cawdor. Brutal subservience with a thin veneer of generosity, or the closest thing in 40k to actually earning your place in a somewhat fair system? That's for you to decide. House Van Saar is next, and you know what their claim to fame is? They have a working STC. That's it. There's two stories for their origins, the former of which I prefer, but the latter of which probably makes a bit more sense. Story 1. Towards the end of the Dark Age of technology, a ship named the Van Saar with an engineer on board named Van Saar set off from Earth looking for a bright, starry science fiction future. Instead, it got lost in the warp for 10,000 years and crash-landed on Necromunda. The survivors led by Van Saar crawled out of the Van Saar, salvaged what they could, including the STC, and eventually by virtue of owning a goddamn STC, became House Van Saar. I'll take a Van Saar meal, hold the Van Saar, extra Van Saar on the side, and a diet Van Saar, please. Story 2 is the same, except there were no survivors, and it was just a bunch of scavengers that found the mother of all jackpots and rose to greatness from it. Now, the STC they have was damaged in the crash, but it still works for making stuff. The issue is that it constantly leaks radiation to the point that it causes everyone to have to wear hazmat suits all the time in Van Saar to avoid immediate cancer on their everything. As the trade-off for this, I would just like to reiterate, they own an STC. It makes everything, and everything it makes is of immaculate quality. And while Van Saar probably doesn't understand completely what they have, lending some more credence to the lucky scavengers theory, they understand it well enough to make themselves the richest house by virtue of selling things no one else could even conceive of. In a setting as grimy and dirty as 40k, where even the most high-tech human stuff is usually covered in oil, rust, and God knows what else, these assholes are running around with 343 Halo Foreigner light brights all over themselves. Unlike almost everyone else in the Imperium that would get a hold of this kind of thing, though, they are absurdly careful with it, which explains why they haven't just taken over Necromunda. They probably could, but they know they're committing outright tech heresy by hiding it from the AdMech, and skirting the lines of tech heresy by pretending to invent things that were just printed out that are certainly not Imperial standard. Anything non-standard they sell is at a premium, and the people who buy it need to take care to hide it themselves because now they're flaunting Imperial decree. To maintain this secrecy, they used to move it around regularly in order to keep it hidden. Since it leaked radiation, they hid it in places like exhaust vents from the planet's core, where the constant heat would hide the radiation leaking as just more heat. And then one day they couldn't move it anymore, which led to them building a bunch of fake ones. This has the unfortunate side effect of absolutely indicating that Van Saar is something to hide, but the other option was to just leave it be and have only one big source of radiation leaking out. At least this way they can just lie and say they have a bunch of science experiments all over the place or something like that. Their secrecy has been breached before, but Necromunda is like a house of cards where the great houses are in constant balance with one another. With Van Saar, it's a case of either wanting to keep the wealth they generate from their productions flowing, or not wanting the AdMech to rip them all apart when they realize what Van Saar is hiding, so no one's pulled the rug out from under them quite yet. If all this secrecy and radiation sickness sounds like it's too much, let me just remind you for, what, the fourth time here? Standard, template, construct. The answer to the question, is this worth an STC, is yes. Full stop. They may need to keep themselves in secrecy, they may need to constantly wire up cybernetics and wear armor that doubles as a radiation suit to stay alive, but all of that is worth it because it's an endless supply of whatever they want. The STC in recent times even went into some sort of emergency mode, but rather than being a low battery warning, it started creating all sorts of crazy items never before seen. The need for secrecy is greater than ever before, but the potential profits, research benefits, and more have just gone that much higher. The funny thing is, a lot of Van Saar members don't even realize there's an STC, or why they constantly need to give themselves radiation poisoning. The higher up in the ranks, the more you know about it. Their version of Tech Priest, called Archaeotechs, don't have all the religious symbolism of the AdMech, which is either a nice breath of fresh air or absolute design-ruining heresy and stupid, depending on your tastes. The highest-ranking ones get to rub their grubby hands all over the STC and are consequently a lot more augmented because of all the radiation. It's a fun faction and probably my favorite, because my preferred backstory belief makes them a bunch of unlucky schmucks that got isekai'd into 40k from right before things got real shitty for humanity. Plus, it's a cool taste of the dark age of technology, and those are always fun to see. Those are the major great houses, but there's a few more factions to discuss. Not too deep into these, since the rest are fairly simple, but they're still fun and worth a mention. The first is the Waste Nomads. These are the unluckiest sons of bitches on a Hive world because they have to live outside of a hive. It really sucks out there, but they've adapted well enough, all things considered. They could be any number of things, since the ash wastes outside aren't as developed as all the crazy stuff in the hives. Some rumors say they're leftover remnants of the Irenaeus continuity, raiding Imperial shipping to this very day. Other versions are more standard nomads, doing what they must to survive. In either case, they ride cool bugs and have Fallout Raider armor. Homebrew however you see fit, and draw from where you can to make the psycho-fueled army of your wasteland dreams. The corpse grinder cults are a very special breed of corn worship. See, in case you've missed the message, hive cities in the Imperium at large are quite grim. The mainstay of food they eat that isn't some sort of mutated animal is usually a recycled human being. In order to recycle it, some poor bastards have to work the assembly line that grinds people into powder. And for most people, collecting and eating your dead grandma as a protein bar is pretty fucked up. So some people snap. They join the corpse grinder cult, because if you're crazy, you might as well go all in on it. And if nothing else, fresh flesh tastes better than a chalky powdered bar of flesh. Now firmly in the arms of heresy, the various corpse grinder cults are always put down, but because of both overpopulation and the Imperium being the poster child of needless cruelty, they always pop back up. Word of advice, send a couple more ships of food every month so that the population stops eating itself. Maybe the crazy cannibals will stop showing up as much. The second to last group is the Ironhead Squat Prospectors. After the Horus Heresy and whatever the hell crawled out of those warp gates, hope you didn't forget about them, Necromunda was such a mess that the Imperium called in some leagues of Votann to clean up a bit. And some of them just didn't leave, because by God is Necromunda covered in garbage for them to turn into usable material. At some point they lost their Votann, which is lending credence to a third Van Saar theory, which is that some of them just took the goddamn thing and ran off with it to create a noble house. Nowadays they've been there so long the average Necromundan doesn't even know their kin, instead seeing them as more wasteland abhumans. They live in one of 12 clans that sally out from giant fortresses to scavenge the wastes and bring back goodies. Some Necromundans are smart enough to know they're at least good for their word as long as you can meet their prices, so they get a lot of work that way. I'd not recommend trying to scam them out of a deal, though. Votan or not, they retain their grudges in higher than average tech, so you'll probably find yourself atomized if you try to go back on a deal you made with them. In general, their presence is tolerated enough, and since they were the first round of the squats coming back, they still retain the name as part of their official branding. They're also the closest to the squats of old, both in design and with one of the special characters having the name Grendel Grendelsen. Look to them if you want some higher tech scavengers, or if like me you still dream of the American biker dwarfs of olden 40k and weep tears over what we've lost. Worth noting is that we also have more generic chaos cults as well as gene stealers in Necromunda, but again, who cares? I can find those assholes anywhere else in the setting, give me something better. Something like the Palatine Enforcers. Police come in a lot of flavors in 40k. The Adeptus Arbites are of course Judge Dredd. 10% originality to 90 parts going, hey, isn't Judge Dredd cool? That's not a complaint, mind you, because they're right, Judge Dredd is cool. Other times it's the Inquisition, a wonderful mix of the Gestapo, the KGB, and the Illuminati. And sometimes you get the Palatine Enforcers, which are like if every single cloaker that ever knocked you on your ass in PayDay 2 was combined into an army. It doesn't matter if you're resisting arrest or not, because you are getting difficulty tweaked. Palatine Enforcers are given a brutal training regimen until they can either take on the Underhive and come out on top, or they drop dead. As a result, they're just what I said earlier. Have you ever reached the point in a PayDay 2 heist where you have to wonder why the hell the military is getting involved when surely it'd be cheaper to just let you rob the goddamn bank at that point? In these guys' case, it's because the idea of basic human dignity has been beaten out in favor of smacking anyone who so much as twitches out of line over the head with a law book. The safe word isn't police brutality because the safe word does not exist, so if you want your opponent to go to the forums and cry like the little bitch they are, then run some Palatine. I should really play PayDay 2 again. And that's a very basic rundown of Necromunda, its great houses, and some of the other standouts. Honestly, if you haven't at least briefly checked out some of the books, I'd highly recommend them. They're proof, if nothing else, that we don't need a constant barrage of Primarchs, galaxy-ending events, and whatever else is being shoved down your throat this day to create an interesting story. You just need some characters and the pile of garbage they call home. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the gangs to my Necromunda, the special sauce keeping this house of cards interesting. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. There's also Hired Gun if it slipped under your radar back when. It was a fun game. Not going to be as fun as Doom 2016, which it's certainly taken influence from, but let's be real with ourselves. The most mediocre of new Doom clones is better than 90% of other games.